Welcome to the Life Plus God podcast. My name is Alyssa Robinson. I am your host. Probably know me. If not, it's nice to meet you. And I am here with Reverend Gracie Millard, one of our associate pastors at Treach Memorial United Methodist Church. Hey, Gracie.
Hello.
It's
good
so
to be
good
here.
to see you.
Good to see you after that hour.
I know. I act like I haven't seen you in forever, and we
Yeah.
literally just had lunch together. So
We love it.
big question today. Big question every time.
I was going to say, how's that different from any other time I'm sitting here?
Today's question is one of those, it is like the number one reason that I hear people walk away from the church and why they reject Christianity, reject the whole idea of the faith, all based in this question. And the question is, why do I see so much hypocrisy in the church?
Yeah.
And it hits really hard because I feel like the natural answer is because we're human beings and we mess up.
Yeah, that's what everybody said at lunch. Like, why is this a podcast?
Yeah, why is this a whole episode? Because we're human.
Yeah.
But I kind of want to dig into it because, like I said, it is the number one reason. And yes, we're human, but we're doing this over and over and over again and ostracizing people. And why does this keep happening? Why does hypocrisy keep happening? Why are we not learning from it and trying to improve? So we're going to have a little bit of fun with this today. For the sake of the conversation, how do you want to define hypocrisy? How are we navigating this?
So I think generally we would agree that hypocrisy is when people hold others to this moral standard that they don't follow through with themselves. That's the general definition that I think is pretty applicable to the church. More directly for the church, I would say that it's honoring God and maybe in word, but not in deed. Like that, they're claiming all these things and saying we should all practice this or do this or that they believe this, but they don't actually live that out. So,
yeah. And I think that is across the board. It could mean so many different things because I think that we've all seen scandals in the news of religious leaders who there's a sex scandal that comes out and they've been sexually abusing people in their congregation. Obviously, that's extremely hypocritical, but even on a less criminal side of things of telling you to love all people, but then somehow there's exceptions to the rule for people who aren't living the life that you think is godly or following scripture or whatever, however you define the way that life should be, I put in air quotes, should be lived. And yet you're preaching to love everyone and you reject the way that people choose to live their lives or don't choose to live their lives if it's just the situation that they're in.
Right.
What are some of the main examples of hypocrisy that you see regularly in the church that you think are just continuously pushing people away?
Yeah, I think you've named most of the ones that I thought of immediately, which the biggest one I think is not actually welcoming all people and not actually truly loving all people. Like we all claim that anybody is welcome, but once they walk in the doors, are they really welcome? Like we say we want people to come, anybody to come, but would we really be okay with anybody coming?
Yeah. Or if you do come, yes, everybody's welcome, but once you walk their doors, conform.
Right, but change. You have to change. So I would say that's the biggest, most blatant example that I think frustrates people most about the church is that they weren't accepted and they claim to be a loving group of people. And I mean, the next one is sadly sex scandals. It's rampant, especially when that's such a hot topic for a lot of churches that they preach against this sexual or they preach for this sexual purity, and then inevitably there's some sexual misconduct, and then you're like, what? Are you kidding me?
But I even think one of the ones that I see often, and I'm guilty of working at a church, is I'm constantly calling people to serve and to, be missional and to do things outside of the church. But am I? Not often, because it feels like that's my job. Like I sometimes make the excuse of like, oh, well, my act of service to God is working for the church, but I'm not doing things outside of my work hours to serve others.
Yeah.
And so in that sense, I'm also a hypocrite.
Yeah. Yeah. People in my life group would attest to that epiphany I had a few weeks ago where we had asked the question, what did you do to live out your faith this week? And I was thinking, okay, so outside of work, in my mind, I was like, oh my gosh.
I binged this show on Netflix.
I didn't do a single thing that wasn't part of my job. And that was a wake up call. So I think the list goes on of ways that there's hypocrisy in the church, but I think the biggest one is the one we named first, and that's the one that drives the most people away.
Yeah. We claim to be a faith built on love, and yet we are the least loving and the most judgmental people that you'll run into.
Yeah.
And this might not be a fair question because I have not explored other religions enough to claim this, but I will say it feels like Christians suffer more from hypocrisy than any other religion. We just don't practice what we preach. And when I meet people of other faiths, it seems that they do practice what they preach, and they're much more devout. And so why do you think that our faith tradition, we just can't seem to get outside of that hypocrisy? Or am I just being naive because it's like what I'm constantly surrounded by?
No, I think there's some element of truth to it that we are definitely, that as Christians, maybe it's just that the spotlight is on us. So it's just easier to see because there's more of us, and we get kind of the spotlight in the news because that's the majority of people. This, is accepted as the, most people will know who, and you know what I'm trying to say, of like, we're the societal standard, I guess.
Yeah. I guess it is like whatever is the main religion of whatever country you're in is in power, and the culture caters to you.
Right.
And so if you were looking at an Islamic nation, maybe the hypocrisy is much more apparent than what we see here, because Christianity is the dominating religion in the United States.
Right. And so that's where my mind kind of went when I was looking at this question. Was thinking about, well, I think it's maybe just confirmation bias because we just see it so much, and that once anything is connected with power corrupts, and power's or humility, and that's gonna have a hard time competing with power. Power, once we can't deny that, Christianity became locked in with the state back in with Constantine. And once it was associated with that, it exploded in popularity, but then it also was connected to government and power and authority. And so I think that when anything is connected to power, there's bound to be hypocrisy, and it's just ripe for hypocrisy, especially when that's the almost exactly what Jesus was preaching as the good news. Like, that's the opposite of what Jesus's good news was about the overturning of power, and that the last shall be first, and everything from the bottom. So I think the very fact that Christianity is in power is a hypocritical, maybe that's a bold statement, but is an act of hypocrisy.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Well, does that mean that if we are in the United States participating in the Christian faith, that we are automatically hypocrites because it's so comfortable to be a Christian here?
I don't know. I don't want to say that just automatically makes you a hypocrite, but I think it's a lot easier to fall into because it's the societal standard that whatever the societal standard is not necessarily what the religion like the true religion is. So, I mean, I would argue that it's not true Christianity to, that, you know, the American culture, Western culture is not necessarily true Christianity religion. A lot of the values are, but we know that there's a lot of values that aren't and that have been kind of co-opted. So I don't think the true way is hypocritical, but I think it's really easy to give in to and think that you are a true Christian. And I don't want to shame anybody because I mean, we all, we're all guilty of it, and it's easy. It's just an easy trap to fall into. So,
Well, do you remember the first time you experienced hypocrisy in the church in a substantial way that you kind of were like, ooh?
Well, I don't know if you'll count this as substantial, but it was the first time I kind of got frustrated and questioned, like, the people in charge. Was growing up in youth group, that the youth pastors just completely favored this one group of kids that were the quote unquote cool kids at school too. And it was very obvious that, like, that's who they spent all their time with. That's who they connected with and went out of their way to talk to. And the rest of us felt very not welcome.
You mean you weren't one of the cool kids?
Alyssa. No. And so I was like, I just remember being very confused, thinking that I thought church was supposed to be a place where everybody was welcome and that everybody belonged. And that was really disconcerting for me.
Yeah. I had a similar experience. Mine was a little weird because, like, in a sense, I was one of the cool kids. I was not cool at all at school. I was very introverted and quiet and had very few friends at school.
Okay.
But church was like a second home to me because my mom worked at the church.
Sure.
And so I was basically like a staff kid. And so, like, I was treated very differently at church than I was anywhere else. And it felt like my safe space.
Sure.
And so I was kind of like in the in crowd, but it wasn't, I don't know. Like, I think it probably was hurtful to some people from, like, who didn't feel like they had the same connection to the staff that I did, to the volunteers that I did. But, like, I was literally at the church 4 or 5 days a week.
Right.
But I saw that. I did see that. And it was painful to see that there were kids that came into our youth group who they could be there for 2 hours and nobody spoke to them. And I wish I could say I had the emotional maturity at the time to be the person who went up and talked to them. Sometimes I did, but most of the time I just was like happy to be spending time with my friends and the people who made me feel loved. So I guess, like, it would have been the adult's responsibility to include that kid.
Right.
But
I hope you're not hearing me like I'm shaming anybody who didn't say that. I mean, like, that's in an ideal world, everybody would, notice people who were feeling
Yeah.
like outsiders all the time, but like
But what I'm
also
saying
teenagers.
is, like, I think anyone who grew up in the church saw that. Like, they saw that happening. I don't think that that's a unique experience. I think that that's in every church, especially in youth groups where it's like, middle school and high school is just a nightmare. And I wish it was different in the church. And it's not. It's like the same. Church is nothing more than a microcosm of the,
School,
society that we're in a different building.
Right.
Like, and we have to fight against that. And we're not always good at it.
Right. Yeah. It's right. It's hard to replicate. I mean, to do exactly that. It's hard to do that. And it's not comfortable. And so I'm just saying that was my first experience of it. And, I don't blame them. Like, everybody's done it, so I have grace for them. I'm over it.
Well, how do you think at the time that affected your faith journey of witnessing that hypocrisy and coming to that realization of something's not right here? Like this isn't the way it's supposed to be.
I think I was probably angry, but
did you keep going?
Yeah, but more than anything, I wanted that approval. I wanted to be part of it, so I would try to somehow, it made me want to try more. Eventually, different youth pastors came in and everything, and that made the transition and the culture change. But it made me want to go, like, it made me want to, like, win them over somehow. But I know it definitely alienated a ton of people.
Yeah.
I know for sure, because I know I had friends who didn't want to go anymore.
Yeah. And I think that that's part of the reason why, like, hypocrisy and judgment can be so painful for people, because it's not something necessarily that you see the hypocrisy and you're like, well, I don't want to be a part of that. And you immediately walk away. For maybe some it is, but I think for others, it's what you said of, like, I want to be accepted. I want that love that was promised to me that you said. And so maybe I need to make an adjustment. Maybe there's something I can change so that I'll be accepted.
Right.
And you're just over and over and over again putting yourself out there and being vulnerable with a group of people who are just over and over again rejecting you and pushing you away and making you feel like an outsider.
Yeah.
And over time, it just creates these open wounds that the healing from that experience could take a lifetime.
Yeah.
So
yeah, it's like, it's very clear why people don't want to come back a lot of the time from what they experience. So
yeah. But I think the key is, like, it's usually not just once.
Right. It's not just once. There's one point that pushes them over that's like, okay, I can't subject myself to this anymore.
Yeah. Well, we talked about this a little bit with your conversation with your life group, but when have you caught yourself being a hypocrite?
Yeah. Well, that was the most recent one. The most recent big one. I'm sure I've been a hypocrite
yesterday.
Since. Yeah. But also when for a good portion of high school and college, I was a pretty big stickler for the rules and for obeying things pretty blindly, and it made me. I was very judgmental about people who broke rules, who cheated on tests, and who had parties on the weekends and drank in high school or drank before they were 21. I was so judgmental about that, and just couldn't understand why people just couldn't follow the rules. And clearly I was not a cool kid. And I remember one of my small group leaders in high school when I was airing these grievances, and she kind of rattled me that she was like, "Have you ever gone above the speed limit?" And I was like, "Well, yeah." And she's like, "So why, is that any different from that other people breaking laws or rules?" And to be fair, I guess I thought that drinking and driving put more people in danger than driving over the speed limit. I rationalized that, but I got her point eventually of that. It was like, you can't really judge people when you're also choosing rules that you don't think are applicable to you, but you're expecting other people to, obey all the laws. So
for me, it's not as much. I've never been a rule follower.
I'm so surprised.
Yeah. I've never been much of a rule follower. Some rules I follow if I think it's a helpful rule. I'm like, oh, I see the benefit to society of this.
Yeah.
But other things, I'm just like, who cares? Like, who cares?
Yeah.
I'm not hurting anybody. Like, this is a personal decision, whatever. But I think what I struggle with most is like giving grace to other people, but expecting grace for myself, because I know my intentions. I know that I'm trying.
Yeah.
I know like all my motivations, all these things about myself. And sometimes I mess up, but I'm like, but it was an accident. Like, give me grace.
Yeah.
But then for some reason, when other people mess up, I make up this story in my mind of like, well, they're had ill intentions,
careless,
and they don't even care. They don't think about anyone but themselves.
Right.
Like it's just, I put all of this evil intention on them of why they did what they did. And yet I know for myself, I don't have evil intentions. Like if I hurt somebody's feelings, it's usually an accident and something that I need to learn from and I can improve upon, like the way I communicate or whatever it is.
Right.
But I don't give the same grace to other people that I give to myself. And it's just constant over and over again, especially with, there are specific people that I'm like, no, I've seen you. I've seen your true colors and I'm never going to trust you again. I'm never going to like open myself up to be hurt by you again because I know you've got evil intentions.
Yeah, no, I remember somebody saying that to me in college. One of my roommates, we were having, I can't remember. We were talking about this one girl. Oops. And she was saying that that this girl has higher standards for others than she does for herself, or that she has higher expectations of other people, and more grace for herself than she does for other people, and how it should be reversed. And I ended up discovering somewhere along the way that John Wesley says something about that, of like, always be willing to extend grace for others and be hard on yourself, basically, was the gist of it. And I think that's a really helpful way to think about it. And that was one of kind of the definitions I wrote down of when you're asking to define hypocrisy, is like somebody who has higher standards for other people than they do for themselves. So what
does the Bible have to say about all of this?
I am so glad you asked.
Yeah, what does the Bible tell us about hypocrisy?
So I just went to the New Testament. I didn't even check the Old Testament. Oops. But I know the prophets have to talk about it. But Jesus in Matthew talks about hypocrites all the time. And it's always in reference to the Pharisees, which was really interesting. It's usually the passages that I kind of like.
Will you kind of tell us who the Pharisees
skip
are
over?
For people who don't know?
So the Pharisees,
asking for a friend here.
Right, exactly. So the Pharisees were the religious leaders, the Jewish religious leaders. So they were really well trained in the law. They read and interpreted the Torah for other people. So they had this kind of unique role that they were they were one of the few people who were able to read. And so they were able to read the Torah, and then, which is the first 5 books of what we know as the Old Testament, and interpret that for all the Jewish people. And that was,
so the people looked to them as like a religious authority.
Yes. Yeah. Especially since the temple used to be the defining characteristic for Jewish people. And then once the temple was destroyed, they needed something that, and the diaspora and everything, when they were spread out from Israel and conquered by other lands.
I don't know what that is either.
Okay.
Diaspora.
It was when like Babylon conquered them, and then they they exiled them to they took the people out of Israel, Babylon did, and made them move over, like, and took them away from their land. And so then over the hundreds of years that the Israelite people were under foreign rule, a lot of people stayed there. And so then what used to be a concentrated area of Jewish people is now spread out all over, kind of, they're no longer in one place. So now they need something that unifies them and is a cultural identity. And so they make that the Torah. And so like their whole cultural identity, religious identity is based, not all of it, but I mean, it's concentrated in the Torah and that interpretation and the following those laws. And so Jesus has a few things to say to the Pharisees for how they've been interpreting these laws and holding people to such high standards, but they themselves aren't really practicing this, or that Jesus really gets frustrated that they're doing things for other people's attention rather than for the spirit of the law, which is to worship God and to honor God. So that he over and over again is like, you guys are so caught up in the details of like, you can't heal on the Sabbath, but yet it's okay for you to do this, that, or the other. And he's like, you're missing the point. But there's this passage in Matthew that's almost the whole chapter 23, where Jesus calls them hypocrites 6 times. And he says, woe to you hypocrites, you Pharisees, you hypocrites. And it's basically just him getting frustrated at them for being showboats and being like, aren't I so holy and amazing, and I follow all the laws, and they want all this glory and honor. And they hold other people, but then they hold other people to these high standards. Verse 13, he says, you shut people out of the kingdom of heaven. Ooh. And yeah, he says, woe to you Pharisees, you shut people out of the kingdom of heaven. You won't even enter yourselves, and you won't allow the people who want to enter to do so. So he's like, you're not only misleading people, you're preventing people from actually knowing the heart of God. So Jesus is really angry at them, because it's not just that they're like showboating and misinterpreting, but they're literally leading people away who are trying to follow the spirit of the law and love God and love others. So these people
are seeking God and being led astray to who God really is and how to be in relationship with God. And instead they're met with judgment and a list of rules that
is impossible to carry,
to follow.
That the Pharisees themselves don't really even carry, but it's all that power that they have, that the Pharisees have. And I think that's
feels familiar.
Yeah. Reading Matthew 23, I was like, oh my gosh, this is like reading something about today's religious leaders. And knowing the weight of authority that religious leaders have is so intimidating to me. And I always hope that I will never do anything like this. But I mean, on the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says, don't pray like the hypocrites, because they go out and do it in the street corner and they're like, oh God, thank you for everything. And look how holy I am, everybody. And Jesus says they get their own reward from people seeing them, but you need to go and pray in quiet. Don't be like the hypocrites who are showy about their generosity, but you need to go and do that in private where nobody can see you. So it seems like there's a lot going on about ways that you can be a hypocrite, apparently. So it's like doing things for other people's attention and not God's glory, and leading people away from God in the name of God.
But did they know they were leading people away from God? Because that's what I get confused by, is like, we're so blind to our own hypocrisy. And like, if I'm thinking about these Pharisees and I'm extending grace, like I said, I'm bad at, and thinking, okay, did they actually, because I think of the Pharisees as like evil intentioned people.
Right.
Well, is that really,
which is not super fair.
Yeah. Did they think that they were like following the rules is how you get to God, and they were misled in some way misled. Okay. They were misled in some way because these Pharisees would have been taught by someone else how to be in relationship with God. And so I'm guessing it's like generation after generation, because you said it's hundreds of years of this developing.
Yeah.
And they're just repeating what they've been taught.
Right.
And so like, man,
I think
how do we see our own hypocrisy?
It's really hard. No, I think that's a really good point. I'm glad you brought that up, because it's definitely like the author of Matthew is definitely trying to say something about religious leaders and how easy it can be to fall into hypocrisy. So they definitely get a bad rap, and I fell into that by just how describing them. But
I mean, he uses pretty rough language to describe them, so I understand seeing them as the enemy,
Yes. And so it definitely, it's not for Jesus definitely uses that harsh language with them, at least as Matthew records it, but none of the other gospels record that much. But it's really, I think, more painted as a foil to this is what true discipleship would look like, versus that Jesus really, didn't love the Pharisees. I think Jesus, well, we can get into talking about redeemability and all that. I mean, I believe everybody's redeemable. That's just aside. So I think Jesus is more making a point about religious leadership and how easy it is to fall into that, because I think you're right. I think they're just doing what they had been taught, and maybe what Jesus is saying is like, you need to be always questioning things. You need to always be asking why, and if always asking, is this going after the heart of God? Yeah. I think what Jesus is trying to get us to do, everybody to do, from the ordinary Joes to the religious leaders, is to be humble, take on a spirit of humility and wonder, am I doing the thing that God is really calling me to do? Or is this really what God wants? Not just doing it because you're doing, you've been taught to do it.
And it is to have that spirit of humility, but then also be a leader of a church.
Yeah.
It almost seems like we're setting people up for failure, because I would say people who are naturally drawn to becoming pastors, if they haven't really done that self-examination, like you said, why am I really seeking the Spirit of God? I think it's easy if you're a very charismatic person, if you're someone that people are drawn to, if you're someone that people want to listen to, because of that charisma.
Yeah.
All of these things, you can fool yourself into thinking, oh, I'm a messenger of God.
Right.
Because people want to hear what I have to say. And there's no humility in any of that. And so like we have all of these leaders in the church who it is a point of pride. And like you can tell by the way someone delivers a message on Sunday morning, like for me, I'm very, my hackles are up at all times when I'm going to a new church. I'm very judgmental, I guess you could say. Hypocritical maybe, but I'm
careful.
Cautious.
Cautious.
Yes, because I'm listening to like, okay, how are they delivering this message? Are they using speech patterns where they're trying to get emotional rise out of people?
Sure.
Are they using music in a way that it manipulates the feeling of the room? Like, what is it that they're really trying to accomplish here? And what is it about? Because I have been in a lot of rooms where I know there is a specific pattern of speech that inspires people no matter what you're saying. It doesn't matter if what you're saying has any depth to it. If you say it in a certain way, people will fall for it.
No, I agree with you. I do that too. I always am, the first time hearing anybody speak, I try to pick up on the genuineness of the message and how God-centric it is versus how, like, if it's like touting themselves or manipulating scripture or whatever. I think that's okay to do. I think where it comes down to me is the leader willing to be questioned? Is the leader willing to maybe be wrong? And the leaders who don't allow questions, who don't allow themselves to be questioned or their authority to be questioned, I think are the ones to be watchful of. I think you'd find that the true leaders, the true people, or the people that God truly calls into spiritual leadership, pastoral leadership, are people who don't really, who are really willing to be questioned and willing to have conversations, and who are not necessarily drawn to that role in the first place, but are doing it because God called them to. So, just one girl's opinion.
Do you think that there are ways that we're hypocrites that we don't even realize? So like back to the question of, are we blind to our own, why are we blind to our own hypocrisy? Like this might be an impossible question to answer, but like, what are the daily things that we engage in that are hypocritical that we need to open our eyes to?
That is a hard question. Because it's a
Tell me the things that you don't see.
Right, exactly.
Like,
Holy Spirit, now's your time. Yeah, I think it's obviously hard to say what it is we're hypocritical about that we don't realize we are. And since we live in a society, I think it's impossible not to be just completely 100% just, like, versus like participating in things that are unjust. Like all the paper that we use, like we don't really need to use all the paper, but it's more convenient and it would be more expensive. Like I think that's one thing that my brain always goes to is how we spend our church dollars. Are we better stewards of it if we buy things that are only fair trade and only responsibly made and zero emissions, that are
but it's
5 or 6
our
times
budget,
more expensive? Or are we to be better stewards by buying
Stuff
the
at
least
Walmart.
expensive things, even though we know that the people who are making those are not getting livable wages? So that to me is like the classic example, is like how you can't really win either way.
Well, and that one really hits home for this church because a few years ago, when Reverend Clay Horton was in your role, he made that attempt to switch us over because, we have our coffee in the office in the morning,
Sure.
we have our snacks, we have all those things. And so he was trying to switch us over to all fair trade.
Mm-hmm.
And we had to stop doing it because it was too expensive.
Yeah.
And it was heartbreaking that we couldn't afford to make that happen and say, okay, is it better to just go without, to not have coffee?
Right.
Like, to not offer things to people?
Right.
Because is it better to do the fair trade route? And if you can't afford it, just don't do anything at all.
Right.
I don't know.
And when we, think of all the ways that the world is unjust, it's impossible for us to solve all of those problems.
Yeah.
So I had to just let myself live because otherwise you would just crumple into a ball and be like, I can't, everything I do. My house was, built with wood that was gotten from a farm that's not sustainable. There's nowhere that we're touching that didn't have some element of unfairness. And so I had to resign myself to a point where it's like, I'm just going to do what I can and do my best, Lord help us, just truly. There's just so much
it feels
to
like
do.
there are no right answers.
Right. No, because it's like
everything you do hurts somebody in some way.
Yeah,
either
nothing
directly
is free
or indirectly.
Right. Yeah. So I'm sorry to take us down that really depressing road.
So sad.
No. I once watched in seminary, they showed us this video about how most of the problems of the world are interconnected, and I just left class sobbing. I was like, there is no hope. What are we gonna do?
Thanks, seminary.
Yeah, I was like, and as I was driving my car, I was like, dang it, I'm contributing to global warming as I drive home and drinking out of my plastic cup. Oh my gosh. And, this clothes that I'm wearing are not fair trade.
Fast fashion.
Yeah.
Ugh.
It was, yeah. So I don't want people to, you have to live. You have to be able to live. But we also are definitely called to action too.
Well, why? So going back to the church and hypocrisy within the church.
Yeah.
This might be, I don't think this is just my feeling. So
Yeah.
I'm just going to generalize and say we're all feeling this way.
Sure.
Why does it feel like there's a greater concentration of hypocrites in the church than anywhere else?
Well, I guess kind of going back to something that we sort of were talking about before, just that we as Christians, we have this morality that we say we follow, and we want other people to follow it too. But the downfall of that is that we're not able to do it perfectly. And so it's really easy to say, hey, you're not doing that, what you told me I have to do. And I'm not saying that, I think we should be held accountable for our actions. But at the same time, so it's that balance of how much grace can be shown, and after how much time, Jesus says forgive 70 times 7. So always forgive, but also I think that where people get really frustrated is that, hey, you punished me for that when I did that. I suffered really bad consequences. Why aren't you having to suffer that too? Or why are, you get to do it in secret and I don't, and I have this guilt and shame. So that's definitely a fair point to say, we should not be punishing people we should not be punishing and judging people for breaking the rules or.
Well, and it kind of is, when you mention morality, the truth is, values and morality are subjective.
Mm-hmm.
That is a deeply personal thing.
Yeah.
But what we do as the Christian church is we treat them as if they're objective.
Right.
And we treat them as if these are, like you said, these are the rules to follow. I don't care what your value system is. Whatever your value system is, mine trumps yours.
Right.
Because mine is of God.
Right.
And so it just carries this weight of judgment. And it's what you said earlier, of it's just this lack of humility of like, my way is the right way, my way is the only way, or the best way, or whatever you want to call it. And anything else is less than. When the truth is, like, there are value systems that are different from ours and still glorify God. And we can't, but we just have this immediate judgment of like, if you're not living my way, the way I understand things should be, then you're not living right.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's that lack of humility for sure. And ironically is the whole thing, the whole morality that Jesus really teaches is to always be humble, like humility above everything, you know, serve other people. The one who serves is the greatest, is what Jesus says. But somehow we get convoluted and flip and then say, that's the way. And if you don't do that, then you're bad. And then instead of saying, being humble about our own beliefs and considering,
like, this is something that's really worked for me and I feel a closeness to God from it. You might want to try it.
Right.
Or maybe there's a different way that you feel close to God that you could educate me on, like that.
Yeah.
As opposed to being like authoritarian in the way you are to be in relationship with God.
Right.
What do you think is at the root of hypocrisy? Like, is it power? Control? Like, what?
I think it's, generally power, pride. It's
ego, maybe
ego. It's that, I think it's that, my gut was pride, but that's,
I am kind of landing on the thought of like the opposite of hypocrisy is humility, of like through this whole thing of like, if we're trying to be anti-hypocrite, adopt a humble attitude. So that would make sense that like the root of humility would be, or root of hypocrisy would be pride.
Right. Because if you're thinking that like holding other people to this standard and say, but I don't need to be held to that standard. It's like, why don't you? Like, why aren't you, or I deserve grace, but other people need some punishment. And it's like that inability to see yourself as ever doing, maybe it's the inability to see yourself as doing something wrong or that you could be wrong. So I think that's my short answer.
Maybe
pride.
Arrogance
is in there for sure. Yeah. And
all
then
of the
there's
fun
also
stuff.
but also like ignorance that like you aren't aware.
It's a lack of self-awareness for sure.
Yeah. That might be it. Is just
because I don't think that anyone is like setting out to be a hypocrite.
Yeah. Hopefully. Yeah. Exactly. You do. It's something that you're probably right that like something you accidentally do that and you don't realize until later or never at all.
Yeah.
That you're like, oh, wait, I just did something I told other people they can't do.
So what do you think that we can do? So we've talked a lot about hypocrisy can come from a lack of self-awareness. Sometimes we're blind to it. We don't even realize that we're doing it. What can we do to avoid hypocrisy and live more humbly or honestly? What are some practical steps that we can take? Because I think it's really difficult for us to see our own hypocrisy. Like, I've heard very few people when we're reading the story of the Pharisees saying, oh, I relate to the Pharisee.
It's like, oh yeah, I totally do that.
They're like, I know someone who has acted like this Pharisee, but I don't hear a lot of people be like, oh yeah, that's me.
Right. Ooh, I totally do that. Yeah. I totally prevent people from coming to God.
Yeah.
Well, okay, so practical ways to practice humility.
Well, I think you've already named one. I'm gonna recall of asking yourself, why are you doing what you're doing? And that's so like that introspection, I think, is really important, of like a willingness to check yourself and saying like, hey, am I doing this to glorify God or glorify myself? And to have to be honest with yourself, because that's the hardest part.
The being willing to be honest with yourself. I mean, a lot of it is just self-discipline, which if you're like me, that's really, really hard. So practicing humility will take a lot of introspection, but I think it's easier, or you can have that accountability from another person too, that you trust, that is really hard, because you then have somebody who's actually going to hold you accountable versus somebody who's just going to be like, oh, like, don't worry.
I've had that conversation with people before that I'm like, I want you to call me out. Like, if you see me doing this, call me out on it. Like, I want to be better. I want to do better. That is kind of my personality type too. So that comes more, it's not something that scares me, is to be held accountable. I find it really helpful. It removes the secrecy and invites other people into your journey.
Yeah.
And that can be very humbling.
Yes. But it's a willingness to change and a willingness to be all that God calls us to be, and a willingness to become more like God. So it is hard, but I think it's necessary. If, some people are more, tend towards more humility, as in like they're really critical of themselves. So there's, it depends on the personality type that you are, because some people don't want to be questioned and other people only question themselves. That's me. So having somebody hold you accountable who is a loving, it's a loving accountability, but a real accountability. And that willingness to question yourself and to be questioned. I think just praying to God and reminding yourself of who's who here. And that's always been helpful for me, is to put myself in my place and God's place, or put God in God's place. I don't know, considering other points of view and perspectives and exposing yourself to other perspectives. I think we have a really hard time. No, none of us want to be wrong, and we are comfortable in the spaces and the things that we take in content-wise and people-wise. But when we allow for different perspectives, that helps, that trains us to be open to new ideas and the possibility that we were wrong, and maybe not even like that we were. It might really invite this whole new world, a new way of understanding God. But I mean, it can be uncomfortable, and some things are triggering and not healthy to expose yourself to only, but just that willingness and sprinkling in the new people who are different and different backgrounds and different, news sources, that kind of stuff. So I don't know.
So why is there so much hypocrisy in the church?
Because people are people. Yeah. We make mistakes.
Oh, boy. All right. Well, I hope that this was helpful to everybody, or maybe it just made you mad.
Maybe it was, It's either cathartic or really frustrating.
Yeah, like we're here to admit we are members of churches and we get it wrong and we're hypocrites and we're trying to do better. And feel free to call Gracie out on her bad behavior.
Yeah.
In a loving way. No,
also,
I think it is helpful for people to hear church members admit to the hypocrisy and not pretend like it's not there.
Right. Yes.
That can be extremely harmful
for sure.
It's like the ultimate gaslighting of
yes.
the church.
No,
of
it
like,
is.
No, we're not hypocrites. You're imagining it.
No.
You need to shape up. Like if you just changed the way you do things, people wouldn't treat you this way. Or like whatever. Fill in the blank.
Yeah.
It's all nonsense, and we're hypocrites. Yes, we get it wrong.
Yeah.
Hopefully you surround yourself with people who are trying to do better.
Yeah.
And that's all.
That's all we can do.
That's all we can do.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks, Gracie, for yet another episode.
Thanks for having me.
And I'll see you next time because we'll have you back.
Okay, great.
The Life Plus God podcast is hosted, written, and produced by me, Alyssa Robinson, and sponsored by Treach Memorial United Methodist Church in Flower Mound, Texas. If you live in the Flower Mound area, I invite you to stop by and see if Treach could be your new church family. You can learn more about all of our programs and events at tmumc.org, and I hope to catch you next week for our next episode of the Life Plus God podcast.